Week 23, Overview, Conformity and Change. This week covers events from 1956 through 1960, in Eisenhower's second administration. Though there were a few rough spots along the campaign trail, Americans re-elected Ike with a good will, but they didn't return a Republican majority to Congress. That made Ike's job more challenging. This week, younger students will be learning about the ongoing efforts of Martin Luther King Jr. and the movement for civil rights for Black Americans during these years. They're also learning how Americans entertain themselves in this period. A heavier topic for them will be developments in the Cold War, including more U.S. involvement in Vietnam. Older students will learn about a number of cultural changes in the U.S. The fast food industry, rock and roll music, and the countercultural beats, whose literature and lifestyle march to the sound of a different drummer. Dialectic students will learn about African anti-colonialism, and both the older levels will continue to study China and Mao Zedong's daring but disastrous Great Leap Forward. Lastly, there's a new thread introduced this week that will follow together all the way through this unit and into Week 28, the space race. Beginning with the Soviets' surprising launch of Sputnik, the world's first satellite, we'll learn how the superpowers fought the Cold War by conducting a race to see which of them could put a man first into orbit around the Earth and then send a man to walk on the moon. Let's start with space. In the first year of Ike's second administration, on October 5, 1957, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics launched Sputnik into orbit around the Earth. Americans were shocked and dismayed that the rival superpower should have overtaken them in a highly technical advance. Americans thought of themselves as the global technology leaders, and of Russia as underdeveloped in this area. America's first reaction was surprise, followed quickly by fear. If Russia could send satellites overhead, why not nuclear bombs? Americans stared up into the evening sky and trembled. They could actually see their enemy overhead. From fear, many Americans quickly passed on to anger. If the Soviets had moved ahead in science, then America's schools must have failed. Science education became a matter of national security right down to the grade school level. Congress passed the National Defense Education Act less than a year later, which offered funding for scholarships for science students in college and graduate schools. The United States struggled to catch up. The first American rockets were spectacular failures, but they were just the first. In time, America would catch and then surpass the Russian space effort, winning the space race in the early 1970s, as students will learn in Unit 4. The space race is just one of the subjects we've suggested for dialectic level mini-reports. Others cover America's changing culture in this time period. Students can explore the impact of fast food, interstate highways, Elvis Presley, or the beatniks. Ike's most visible impact on the country was the interstate highway system, which was intended to make America easier to defend. During World War II, military convoys sometimes took weeks to cross the country. Imagine stopping at every traffic light on minor roads from New York to Los Angeles. The new interstate system allowed cars to drive from coast to coast without delays. Civil rights is a big topic this week. The effort to desegregate the public schools hit a snag when Arkansas Governor Orville Faubus ordered the Arkansas National Guard to block the access of 9 black students to the high school in Little Rock, defying the Supreme Court's 1954 Brown decision. President Eisenhower had tried to avoid the controversy over desegregation, but Faubus's disobedience was a direct challenge that Ike could not ignore. He sent 1,200 U.S. Army paratroopers to Little Rock to escort the black students to school. Television showed battle-ready U.S. soldiers being mobilized to defend 9 high school students. Many Americans were shocked. That was a step forward in the march toward racial equality, but just one step. There was no lasting change in Little Rock. After those teenagers finished that year at the public high school, Governor Faubus shut down every public high school in Little Rock, and whites put their children in private schools. Things seemed worse for blacks in Little Rock, and Governor Faubus became a hero to Southern whites. Civil rights for blacks seemed like a lost cause. Then, one day in 1961, 4 black college students entered a Woolworth's department store and asked to be served at the whites-only lunch counter. They were ignored by the serving staff, but they sat there peacefully until closing time. The next day, more students joined the sit-in. After that first sit-in of 1961, sit-ins became a popular form of opposition, and the civil rights movement gained fresh momentum. Martin Luther King Jr. saw the potential of the sit-ins. It was a nonviolent form of protest, like the ones Gandhi had used in India. In a sit-in, people would remain seated in a public place until they were either forced out or had their complaints addressed. This technique proved effective because it revealed the weakness of the opponents, who often relied on brute force to remove the demonstrator, thus displaying the flaws of the opponent and gaining sympathy for demonstrators from onlookers. Sit-ins were made-for-TV events. Broadcasts of sit-ins played a large part in their effectiveness, as wider audiences became aware of local conflicts. Unlike the earlier bus boycott, sit-ins broke the laws. Blacks were prohibited by law from sitting at the whites-only counters, but they peacefully defied the segregation laws. Their example inspired young adults of the baby boom generation. White college students across America began to stream south to join the protests. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee volunteers became the shock troops of the civil rights movement. Older students are learning more about Mao Zedong this week. Mao launched his Great Leap Forward in 1958. He wanted China to exceed the industrial output of the United States and Britain, and he called upon Chinese citizens to support him in what he believed would be a great leap in economic and technical development. Dialectic and rhetoric level students should know that Mao believed in the power of the peasants, even though more orthodox Marxists did not. Mao organized rural populations into communes made up of several hundred households each. Each commune was responsible for producing certain amounts of steel, with the overall goal of doubling total steel production in a year. The result of this great effort to produce steel was that not enough people were left to work on the farms, and food production faltered. Because communes were required to meet high food quotas as well as to produce steel, workers often exaggerated the amounts that their harvest had yielded so as to avoid punishment. In addition to this, the leaders who determined the farming methods that peasants were required to use were not experienced in agriculture. Thus, many of the techniques and orders that came from the central government, such as planting crops close together or killing sparrows who were thought to carry disease, led to decreased crop production. As a result of these changes, China endured the worst famine in world history between 1959 and 1961. Due to the combination of the foolish policies of the Great Leap Forward and several natural disasters, between 20 and 40 million Chinese people died of starvation. But even though these terrible food shortages ravaged the country, Mao's government made sure that no one publicly mentioned the famine. In fact, Chinese propaganda of the time encouraged people that it was a virtue to eat less. As a result, even the United States and Great Britain believed the communist claim that China's agricultural production was increasing. That government lie cost tens of millions of lives. The world couldn't feed people if they didn't even know they were starving. While China was dying, Africans were beginning to challenge European colonialism. This week, dialectic students are learning about the rising tide of ethnic nationalism in Africa. Every inch of Africa had been ruled by whites at some time. Ethiopia had maintained the most freedom. Ethiopia, then known as Abyssinia, was one of the first Christian nations on earth. Ethiopia had been an independent nation for many centuries before Europe took over Africa. Ethiopia maintained its independence until Mussolini's Italian army invaded. The Ethiopians didn't surrender, however. Instead, their emperor, Haile Selassie, took his case to the General Assembly of the League of Nations, where he presented Ethiopia's grievances. He spoke of the Italians as committing unethical warfare, as established by the Geneva Convention. He gained worldwide attention for his actions, but the League of Nations was completely incapable of doing anything about this act of aggression. World War II changed all that. By 1941, Italy was on the ropes, and Haile Selassie was fighting back. By 1943, Italy gave up its claim on Ethiopia. Haile Selassie became a symbol for the continent, an African leading an African nation. Other Africans began to seek independence. Egypt was under British control, although an Egyptian king, Farouk I, sat on the throne. In 1952, Colonel Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt launched a military coup against the king and became military dictator of Egypt in 1954. Then, in 1956, Nasser took over the Suez Canal and closed it to all Israeli shipping. Britain, France, and Israel invaded Egypt to take the canal back, but then the UN intervened to stop them. Egypt, with some help from the UN, appeared to have thrown off the European yoke, and many Egyptians hailed Nasser as a national hero. These were just the first stirrings of African nationalism. By the early 60s, scores of African nations would break free of colonial rule. We'll touch on that 2 weeks from now, in week 25. The world was changing in the Eisenhower years. The new satellite, Sputnik, orbited a planet in flux. Brave people were changing old ways from Arkansas to Abyssinia, bringing us ever closer to the world we live in now.